The rain came down in sheets, a relentless assault on the Manhattan streets, turning the asphalt into a shimmering black mirror that reflected the neon glow of the city. Elliot Grayson gripped the wheel of his silver Bentley, the wipers slashing furiously against the deluge. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in the day's boardroom battles at Crest Haven Enterprises, where he'd spent hours deflecting questions about profit margins and overseas accounts. At 52, Elliot had built an empire of steel and glass, a name that commanded respect in boardrooms from New York to Hong Kong. But tonight, as the storm raged, something else caught his eye, a flicker of movement that pierced through his carefully curated detachment. There, darting through the downpour, was Amara, the 9-year-old black girl who had haunted the corner outside his office for 3 years, her small frame hunched against the rain, clutching something to her chest. Not coins, not the tattered cup she held each morning, but something alive writhing weakly beneath a bundle of filthy rags. 2 small forms barely discernible in the storm's chaos, babies, newborns, their frail movements betraying their struggle to survive in her thin arms. Elliot's breath caught his heart lurching as he slammed the brakes, the Bentley skidding slightly on the slick pavement. For 3 years, he'd tossed her coins from his window, a ritual that salved his millionaire's conscience, each clink of metal a lie that he was helping. 3 years of ignoring the hunger in her wide, pleading eyes, pretending her existence was a minor inconvenience, a speck on the polished surface of his life. Now watching her stumble through the torrential rain, shielding those infants with her own body, Elliot felt a searing pain in his chest, a cocktail of horror, shame, and something he couldn't name, something he hadn't felt in decades. Amara disappeared into a narrow alley between crumbling tenements, their graffiti-streaked walls looming like sentinels in the dark. Elliot hesitated, his hand frozen on the door handle. The Bentley's engine purred, a cocoon of warmth and luxury, urging him to drive on, to return to his penthouse where the world's miseries couldn't touch him. But the image of those babies so small against Amara's frail frame burned in his mind. He killed the engine and stepped out the rain, soaking his tailored suit in seconds, his Italian loafers sinking into puddles that reeked of sewage and despair. The city's pulse faded behind him as he followed the faint, desperate sound of crying, muffled by the storm. The alley was a labyrinth of decay, overflowing dumpsters, shattered glass crunching underfoot, and the acrid stench of mold clawing at his lungs. His hands trembled not just from the cold, but from a growing dread that he was about to cross a threshold from which there was no return. The crying grew louder, guiding him to a jagged hole in the wall of a condemned building, its bricks crumbling like the edges of his own certainty. A faint glow flickered within, and Elliot crouched, peering through the gap, his heart pounding so fiercely he thought it might burst. Inside, Amara knelt in a makeshift shelter cobbled together from cardboard boxes and torn plastic tarps, a fragile barrier against the world's cruelty. The babies, 2 tiny, emaciated forms, lay on a pile of rags, their weak cries piercing the damp air. Amara was feeding them not with milk, but with warm water dribbled from a punctured plastic bottle. Her movements precise, practiced, as if she'd done this 1,000 times. Her own lips were cracked, her cheeks hollow from hunger, yet she didn't take a sip. "Shh, my little ones," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady, carrying a maturity that no child should possess. "Amara's got you. You're gonna be okay." The word Amara hit Elliot like a slap. She had a name, one he'd never bothered to learn in 3 years of passing her by. He'd seen her as a shadow, a problem to be solved with spare change, not a person with a voice, a story, a soul. The babies whimpered, and Amara wrapped them tighter in the rags, her thin arms trembling under their weight. Then, as she shifted, the dim light caught something on her left arm. A scar, deep and deliberate, shaped like a crescent. Elliot's breath stopped. That crescent was the logo of Cresthaven Enterprises, the same symbol emblazoned on his letterheads, his buildings, his legacy. A mark of ownership burned into a child's skin. His mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the impossible. How could his company's symbol be carved into this girl's flesh? Cresthaven was a titan of industry, real estate, tech, global trade, not some shadowy cartel. Yet the scar was unmistakable. A brutal accusation that tied his empire to this child's suffering. Elliot's knees buckled and he steadied himself against the wall, the rough brick scraping his palm. Memories flooded back, vague whispers of Victor Slade, his business partner of 25 years pushing for special projects. In their early days, deals Elliot had signed off on, without question trusting Victor's ruthless efficiency. Had those deals included this? Branding a child like cattle. The thought made his stomach churn, bile rising in his throat. Amara's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his through the hole in the wall. There was no fear in her gaze, only a weary resignation, as if she'd expected this moment. "You here to take me back?" she asked, her voice calm, but laced with a pain that cut through the storm's roar. She clutched the babies closer, shielding them with her body. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications Elliot couldn't grasp.
Take her back where? Why would a child assume a stranger wanted to drag her somewhere? I just want to help.
Elliot stammered, his voice breaking under the weight of her stare. Amara's eyes narrowed, studying him like a judge weighing a guilty man's soul. Then, unexpectedly, she softened her lips, curling into a sad, knowing smile. "I'm Amara," she said, adjusting the babies in her arms. "This is Iris, and this is Noah. I found them in a dumpster 2 weeks ago. They were crying, left like trash." Her words were matter-of-fact, but they landed like blows. 2 weeks. For 2 weeks, this 9-year-old had been keeping newborns alive, scavenging for water, sheltering them in this rotting hole, while Elliot dined on steak and sipped bourbon in his penthouse. He'd passed her every day, tossing coins, convincing himself he was kind, while she fought to save lives he hadn't even noticed. "You need help," he said, peeling off his soaked coat, the designer fabric useless in this moment. "Let me." "Why now?" Amara interrupted, her voice sharp, cutting through his offer like a blade. 3 years you saw me. 3 years, I begged. You gave me coins, never looked at me. What changed tonight? The question echoed in the damp shelter, each word a mirror reflecting Elliot's cowardice. He wanted to answer, to say it was the babies, the scar, the rain, but the truth was uglier. He'd only cared when the horror was too blatant to ignore, when it shattered the bubble of his indifference. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Amara's gaze held him unflinching, her eyes, older than her years, carrying a wisdom forged in suffering. "They're hungry," she said, turning back to the babies, dismissing his silence. "I need to find more water. It's all I have." Elliot's chest tightened, the weight of his wealth, his power, his entire life pressing down on him. He thought of his penthouse, its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, its emptiness. He thought of the millions in his accounts, the deals he'd signed, the questions he'd never asked Victor. That crescent scar burned in his mind, a symbol of something monstrous lurking beneath his empire's glossy surface. "Come with me," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "My place. It's warm, safe. There's food, blankets." Amara hesitated, her fingers tightening around Iris and Noah, their tiny bodies stirring against her. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, not accusingly, but with a quiet defiance that made Elliot feel small. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've seen." He wanted to tell her he'd protect her, that he'd make it right, but the words felt hollow. Instead, he knelt closer to the hole, rain dripping from his hair, and met her gaze. "I don't know what you've been through, Amara, but I see you now. I see them." He nodded toward the babies. "Let me help you carry them, just for tonight." Her eyes searched his, probing for lies, for weakness. Then slowly she nodded, gathering the babies and the few scraps of cloth that were their only possessions. Elliot reached through the hole, his hands shaking, as he took Iris, her tiny weight, both fragile and immense, in his arms. Amara followed, clutching Noah, her steps careful but sure, a child who'd learned to navigate a world that wanted to crush her. As they stepped into the alley, the rain still hammering down, Elliot felt the ground shift beneath him. This wasn't just about saving a girl and 2 babies, it was about facing whatever truth lay behind that crescent scar. He didn't know what he'd find, but he knew it would unravel everything he thought he was. Amara walked beside him, her small figure dwarfed by the city's towering shadows, yet radiating a strength that made Elliot question every choice he'd made in his 52 years. The Bentley waited its headlights, cutting through the storm, but for the first time it felt like a relic of a life that no longer fit. Whatever came next, Elliot knew one thing: he couldn't go back to pretending. The storm had passed, leaving Manhattan's streets slick and gleaming under the sodium glow of streetlights. But inside Elliot Grayson's penthouse, a different kind of tempest brewed. The sprawling apartment, perched atop a glass tower overlooking Central Park, was a monument to his success. Marble floors polished to a mirror-sheen, modernist furniture that cost more than most people's homes, and floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a conquered kingdom. Yet tonight, it felt cavernous, its sterile opulence mocked by the presence of Amara, the 9-year-old girl who sat cross-legged on the pristine white rug, cradling 2 infants, Iris and Noah, in her thin arms. Their soft coos and occasional cries filled the space, a stark contrast to the silence that had reigned here for years. Elliot stood by the window, his soaked suit clinging to his frame, watching Amara as she dripped water onto his imported wool carpet. Her tattered clothes a jarring intrusion in this world of curated perfection. She was feeding the babies again, using a bottle of formula Elliot had found in his emergency supplies. Her movements careful, but practiced, her face etched with a focus that belied her age. The crescent scar on her arm, the logo of Cresthaven Enterprises, caught the light, a silent accusation that made Elliot's skin crawl. He'd brought her here on impulse, driven by the horror of that rainy alley, but now, in the harsh clarity of his home, the weight of what he'd seen, and what he might have ignored for years, pressed down like a vice. Amara's question from the alley echoed in his mind. Why now? 3 years of tossing coins, 3 years of averting his eyes from her hunger, her pain. He'd built a fortress of denial, convincing himself that his wealth, his charity, absolved him of responsibility. But that scar, that damned crescent, tied her suffering to his empire, to the company he'd poured his life into. Cresthaven Enterprises wasn't just a business. It was his identity, his legacy forged alongside Victor Slade, his partner of 25 years, whose sharp mind and sharper ambition had turned their fledgling venture into a global powerhouse. Victor, with his tailored suits and cold smiles, had always handled the messy details overseas: contracts, labor disputes, acquisitions that skirted the edges of legality. Elliot had signed the papers, asked few questions, and reaped the rewards. Now, staring at Amara's scar, he wondered what those signatures had truly cost. "You're shivering," Elliot said, breaking the silence. He grabbed a cashmere throw from the couch and draped it over Amara's shoulders, careful not to disturb the babies. She flinched at his touch, her eyes flicking up to meet his, wary but not afraid. "You need dry clothes. I'll find something." He rummaged through a guest room closet, pulling out a t-shirt and sweatpants that would drown her small frame, but were better than the sodden rags she wore. Amara hesitated, then nodded gently, laying Iris and Noah in a makeshift nest of blankets on the rug. As she changed in the bathroom, Elliot knelt beside the babies, their tiny faces pale but peaceful, their breathing steadier now with proper formula. He touched Iris's hand, her fingers curling instinctively around his, and felt a pang of something, unfamiliar protectiveness perhaps, or guilt, so deep it masqueraded as care. When Amara returned the oversized clothes hanging off her like a costume, she sat beside the babies, her gaze fixed on them. "They're stronger today," she said softly. "Noah's not coughing as much." Her voice carried a quiet pride, the kind of resilience that made Elliot's chest ache. He wanted to ask about the scar about Cresthaven, but the words felt intrusive, like probing a wound. Instead, he said, "You've been taking care of them alone. For 2 weeks." It wasn't a question, but a statement heavy with the weight of his own inaction. Amara nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of Noah's blanket. "I had to. Nobody else was coming." The simplicity of her words cut deeper than any accusation. Elliot stood pacing to the window, the city's lights blurring as his mind raced. "Amara," he said, turning to face her, "that mark on your arm. The crescent. It's my company's logo. How did it get there?" Her eyes darkened, and for a moment she seemed to shrink, her shoulders hunching as if bracing for a blow. Then she straightened, her voice steady, but laced with pain. "They put it there. After they took me from my mom. Said I belonged to Cresthaven now." The words landed like a punch, knocking the air from Elliot's lungs. "Who's they?" he asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. Amara's gaze didn't waver. "The man who runs your company. Not you. The other one. Victor Slade." The name was a blade slicing through the fog of Elliot's denial. Victor Slade, his partner, his confidant, the man who'd built Cresthaven's empire, while Elliot played the role of charismatic frontman. Victor, who'd always had a knack for solving problems, strikes settled overnight, competitors silenced, audits smoothed over with a handshake. Elliot had trusted him, leaned on his ruthlessness, never questioning the cost. Now Amara's words painted a picture of a monster. "Tell me everything," Elliot said, his voice low, urgent. He sat across from her, the glass coffee table between them, a fragile barrier against the truth. Amara took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the blanket. "My mom was Lila Harper. She worked for you in accounting at your Brooklyn office. She was good with numbers, always stayed late, said she wanted me to have a better life. 2 years ago, she started acting scared. Said she found things in the books, money going places it shouldn't, accounts that didn't add up. She told me to keep quiet, said it was dangerous. Then one night, she didn't come home." Amara's voice cracked, but she pressed on her eyes, glistening. "Men came to our apartment. They grabbed me, said I was collateral. Took me to a place, a big building with no windows. They branded me, said I was Cresthaven's property now. Trained us kids like me to do things. Carry packages, clean rooms, stay quiet. I escaped last year after they hurt my mom. I know she's gone. I saw the papers they thought I couldn't read." Elliot's world tilted, the penthouse's sleek lines warping around him. Lila Harper. The name sparked a vague memory. A quiet woman always at her desk, her presence unremarkable until she vanished. Victor had said she'd quit, move to Chicago for a better job. Elliot hadn't questioned. It hadn't cared. Now the truth was a noose tightening around his neck. "What papers?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Amara reached into her ragged backpack, pulling out a small, battered USB drive, its casing scratched, but intact. "This? I took it before I ran. It's got everything, names, accounts, what they did to my mom, to others. I don't know how to open it all, but I know it's enough to ruin them." Elliot stared at the drive, a tiny object that held the power to dismantle his empire. He stood his legs unsteady and crossed to his home office, a glass-walled sanctum filled with awards and framed contracts. He logged into Cresthaven's secure server, his fingers trembling as he accessed files he'd never bothered to scrutinize. Victor had always handled the financials, the back-end operations, while Elliot charmed investors and signed deals. Now, as he opened restricted folders, the truth spilled out like poison. Offshore accounts in the Cayman's millions, funneled through shell companies, contracts for security services that reeked of extortion. Worst of all, a file labeled Asset Management, a list of names, dates, and statuses. Lila Harper. Terminated, resolved permanently. Beside her name, a note, child transferred to training facility. Other names followed, dozens of employees, all marked as resolved or relocated, with children listed as assets. Elliot's vision blurred, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't just fraud. It was murder, kidnapping, a machine of cruelty built under his nose. He returned to the living room where Amara was humming softly to the babies, her voice a fragile thread of calm in the storm of his thoughts. "Amara," he said, his voice raw, "how did you survive after you escaped?" She looked up, her eyes ancient with pain. "Streets are better than that place. I learned to hide to find food to keep moving. When I found Iris and Noah in that dumpster, I couldn't leave them. They're like me. Nobody else was coming." Her words were a mirror reflecting Elliot's complicity. He'd signed the papers, ignored the red flags, let Victor build a monster while he asked in the glory of Cresthaven's success. A faint noise outside a car door, slamming too deliberate for the late hour, made Elliot freeze. He crossed to the window, peering through the blinds. Two black SUVs idled across the street, their tinted windows hiding whoever watched from within. Victor's men? He was sure of it. He'd seen those vehicles before, parked outside Cresthaven's offices during late-night meetings he was never invited to. "Amara," he said, keeping his voice steady, "we need to leave. Now." She didn't question him, just gathered the babies, her movements swift and silent, a child who'd learned to flee danger without hesitation. Elliot grabbed a duffel bag, stuffing it with cash, a burner phone, and the USB drive Amara handed him. His penthouse, his sanctuary, was no longer safe. Victor knew he'd taken Amara, and he'd come for her, and for the evidence that could destroy him. As they slipped out through a service elevator, the babies nestled against Amara's chest. Elliot's mind raced. He'd spent 25 years trusting Victor, believing they were partners, equals. Now he saw the truth. Victor had used him, a puppet, to front a criminal empire, while Elliot played the role of oblivious magnate. The crescent scar on Amara's arm wasn't just a mark. It was a brand of ownership, a symbol of Victor's control over lives, over children, over everything Elliot thought he'd built. In the elevator's dim light, Amara looked up at him, her eyes fierce despite the fear. "He'll find us," she said, not as a warning but as a fact. "He always does." Elliot nodded, his jaw tight. "Not this time," he said, though doubt gnawed at him. He didn't know where they'd go, but he knew one thing: he'd protect Amara and those babies, no matter the cost. The elevator doors opened to the underground garage, and as they stepped into the shadows, Elliot felt the weight of his past collapsing behind him. The fight was just beginning, and the truth was far darker than he'd ever imagined. The Catskills were a world away from Manhattan's glittering chaos, a realm of shadowed pines and mist-cloaked hills that swallowed sound and light. Elliot Grayson's safe house, a cedar cabin tucked into a remote valley, was meant to be a sanctuary, a place Victor Slade didn't know existed. The drive had taken hours, the Bentley weaving through back roads under a moonless sky, with Amara and the babies Iris and Noah silent in the back seat. Now, as dawn broke, pale light filtered through the cabin's windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Amara sat by a crackling fire, feeding Noah with a bottle, her small frame dwarfed by one of Elliot's old flannel shirts. Iris slept in a makeshift crib fashioned from a dresser drawer, her tiny chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke, a stark contrast to the sewage and decay of the alley where Elliot had found them. Yet, the peace was fragile, a thin veneer over the dread that gnawed at Elliot's gut. Victor's SUVs outside his penthouse had been no coincidence. The man who'd built a criminal empire under Cresthaven's banner was hunting them, and Elliot knew he wouldn't stop until Amara and the USB drive she carried was back under his control. Elliot stood at the kitchen counter, his burner phone in hand, scrolling through encrypted messages he'd sent to Clara Holt, a journalist he'd met years ago at a charity gala. Clara had a reputation for exposing corporate corruption, her articles sharp enough to topple CEOs and senators. If anyone could use Amara's evidence to bring Victor down, it was her. But the USB drive, now hidden in a tin box under the cabin's floorboards, was a puzzle. Amara had warned him it was encrypted, its contents locked behind a code she didn't fully understand. "My mom taught me some things," she'd said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Enough to keep it safe, not enough to open it. Elliot had spent the early morning hours trying to access it on a laptop he kept at the cabin, but the files demanded a 16-digit key, and every failed attempt tightened the knot in his chest. The drive held proof of Victor's crimes, murder, trafficking, the branding of children like Amara. But without the key, it was just a piece of plastic, useless, until Clara could crack it. Outside, the wind hissed through the trees, carrying a chill that seeped into the cabin's walls. Elliot checked the windows, his eyes scanning the forest for movement. The safe house was off the grid, its deed buried under shell companies even Victor didn't know about. But Amara's words from the penthouse haunted him. "He always finds me." She sat now, rocking Noah gently, her gaze distant but alert like a deer sensing a predator. "You're worried?" she said, not looking up. It wasn't a question. Elliot forced a smile, crouching beside her. "We're safe here, Amara. This place is hidden. Nobody knows about it." She met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "He knew about your penthouse. He knows about you." The truth in her words stung. Victor had been his shadow for 25 years, orchestrating Cresthaven's darkest deals, while Elliot played the oblivious frontman. If Victor had tracked them to the penthouse in hours, how long would this cabin stay safe? Elliot stood, his hands restless, and busied himself making coffee, the mundane task a flimsy anchor against the chaos. "Tell me more about the drive," he said, keeping his voice calm. "What did your mom say about it?" Amara adjusted Iris's blanket, her fingers careful but trembling slightly. "She said it was her insurance, said if anything happened to her I should take it and run. She taught me how to hide it, how to set a trap so it'd send the files to someone she trusted if I didn't check in every 3 days." Elliot's eyes widened. "A dead man's switch." Amara nodded, her lips tight. "She called it that. Said it'd go to a friend at the Times if I didn't enter the code. I don't know who, but I kept it going. Reset it every 3 days, wherever I was. The sophistication stunned him, a 9-year-old maintaining a digital fail-safe, a child outsmarting a criminal mastermind. Lila Harper had been more than an accountant. She'd been a warrior arming her daughter with the tools to survive. Elliot's laptop pinged a message from Clara. Got your note. Can meet tomorrow upstate. Send coordinates. Be careful. He typed a response, his fingers clumsy on the keys, and sent the cabin's location through an encrypted app. Clara was their lifeline, but every step toward exposing Victor felt like walking a tightrope over a pit. He glanced at Amara, who was whispering to Noah, her voice soft but fierce. You're gonna grow strong, little man. You and Iris, you're gonna have a real home. The words were a promise, one she'd kept against impossible odds. Elliot wondered how many other children Victor had marked, how many were still trapped in the training facilities Amara described, warehouses where kids were forced to work to obey, to disappear into Cresthaven's machine. A snap outside broke his thoughts. A branch, maybe, or something heavier. Elliot froze his coffee mug halfway to his lips. He set it down, moving silently to the window. The forest was still too still, the kind of quiet that hid danger. He grabbed a hunting rifle from the cabin's closet, a relic from a corporate retreat he'd never enjoyed, and checked its chamber. Amara, he whispered, take the babies to the back room. Lock the door. She didn't argue, scooping Iris and Noah with a speed that spoke of survival instinct. The back room was a panic room, reinforced steel, disguised as rustic wood, built for emergencies Elliot had never imagined facing. As the lock clicked behind her, he crouched by the front window, the rifle cold in his hands. Headlights flickered through the trees, 2 sets moving slowly along the dirt road. SUVs, black and sleek, just like the ones outside his penthouse. Victor's men. Elliot's heart pounded, his mind racing through options. Run, fight, hide. The cabin was isolated miles from help, and Clara wouldn't arrive until tomorrow. He cursed himself for thinking they could outrun Victor, a man who'd built an empire on control, on knowing every move before it was made. The SUV stopped their engines, cutting off, and 4 figures emerged, their silhouettes blurred by the dawn mist. They moved with purpose, fanning out to surround the cabin, their boots crunching on gravel. One carried a flashlight, its beam slicing through the gloom, while another held something heavier, a rifle maybe, or worse. Elliot's phone buzzed a text from an unknown number. Hand over the girl and the drive. Nobody gets hurt. The message was Victor's voice, cold and precise, even through text. Elliot's fingers tightened around the rifle. He wasn't a fighter, not like this, but the thought of Amara branded of Iris and Noah in Victor's hands ignited something primal in him. He typed back, "You'll never touch them." A foolish defiance, but it bought time. He crept to the panic room, knocking softly. "Amara, you okay?" Her voice came through, muffled but steady. "We're fine. They're here, aren't they?" He nodded, though she couldn't see. "Stay quiet. I'll handle this." Back at the window, he watched the men close in, their movements coordinated, professional. Mercenaries, not street thugs. Victor hadn't sent amateurs. A loud crack split the air, a gunshot splintering the cabin's front door. Elliot ducked, his pulse roaring. "Grayson," a voice called sharp and commanding. "Give us the kid, or we come in shooting." Elliot's mind flashed to Amara's scar, to Lila's name marked resolved in Cresthaven's files. This wasn't just about Amara. It was about Iris and Noah, about replacing assets that grew too old, too rebellious. Victor's empire needed fresh children, malleable, disposable. The thought made Elliot's blood boil. Another shot. this one shattering a window glass, spraying across the floor. Elliot fired a warning shot into the air, the rifle's recoil jarring his shoulder. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear and rage. The men paused, but only for a moment. A smoke grenade rolled through the broken window, hissing as it filled the cabin with choking gray clouds. Elliot coughed, his eyes burning, and stumbled toward the panic room. He pounded on the door. "Amara, open it." The lock clicked, and she pulled him inside, her face pale but resolute. The babies were awake, their cries soft but urgent. "They're coming," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "I can help." "No." Elliot snapped, his fear making him sharp. "You stay with Iris and Noah." But Amara was already moving, pulling a small knife from her backpack, a rusted blade barely a weapon, but gripped with the confidence of someone who'd fought to survive. "I know how they work," she said. "I've seen them. They won't stop." Before he could argue, a crash echoed from the main room. The front door breached, footsteps thudded heavy and deliberate. Elliot shoved the rifle into Amara's hands, ignoring her startled look. "If they get through, you shoot. Protect the babies." He grabbed a fire poker from the hearth, its iron cold and heavy, and stepped out to face the intruders. The smoke was thicker now, curling like a living thing. Two men loomed in the haze, their faces masked, weapons raised. Elliot swung the poker, catching one in the arm, a sickening crunch followed by a curse. The second man lunged, but a shot rang out, not from Elliot, but from the panic room. Amara, standing in the doorway, had fired the bullet, grazing the man's leg. He staggered, and Elliot tackled him, adrenaline drowning out his fear. The first man recovered, raising his gun, but Amara fired again this time, hitting the wall, the sound enough to make him hesitate. "Go!" Elliot shouted, shoving her back into the panic room and slamming the door. Outside, engines roared, the other two men retreating to the SUVs. The wounded attackers scrambled after them, leaving a trail of blood on the cabin floor. Elliot leaned against the wall, gasping, his hands shaking as the adrenaline ebbed. Amara opened the panic room door, the rifle still in her hands, her eyes wide but fierce. "They'll be back," she said, her voice flat. "They always come back." Elliot nodded, his mind racing. The USB drive was their only leverage, but they needed Clara to unlock it to expose Victor before he could regroup. He grabbed the duffel bag, checking the burner phone. No signal, not here. They had to move, find a town, a connection, anything to get the evidence to Clara. As they packed, Amara revealed one last secret. "The drive has a backup," she whispered, her eyes on Iris and Noah, now quiet in their makeshift crib. "If they catch me, it sends everything automatically. I set it up like Mom taught me. 3 days, no code, and it's over for him." Elliot stared at her, a 9-year-old who'd outmaneuvered a criminal empire. Her courage shamed him, but it also steeled his resolve. They'd run, fight, do whatever it took to keep her and the babies safe. As they slipped out the cabin's back door, the forest swallowing them, Elliot knew the hunt was far from over. Victor was closing in, and the truth on that drive was their only weapon. The courtroom in downtown Manhattan was a stark contrast to the chaos of the Catskills, its polished wood benches and high ceilings exuding an air of solemn authority. Elliot Grayson sat in the gallery, his tailored suit replaced by a simple button-down, his hands clasped tightly to hide their trembling. Across the room, Victor Slade stood in the defendant's dock, his once impeccable appearance marred by the orange jumpsuit and the faint stubble on his jaw. The man who had orchestrated Cresthaven Enterprises' darkest secrets now faced a jury, his cold eyes scanning the room as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. Amara sat beside Elliot, her small frame rigid, her hands folded in her lap. Iris and Noah were with a trusted social worker in a nearby room, their laughter a distant echo that grounded Elliot in this moment. The past weeks had been a whirlwind Clara Holt's exposé fueled by the decrypted files from Amara's USB drive had ripped through the headlines dismantling Victor's empire overnight. The evidence was damning lists of trafficked children offshore accounts siphoning millions and records of murders disguised as resolutions, including that of Lila Harper Amara's mother. Today, the trial's closing arguments would seal Victor's fate, but it was Amara's testimony that had shifted the tide, her voice carrying a weight that no defense could counter. Elliot glanced at Amara, her face calm, but her eyes fierce. The crescent scar on her arm, now partially covered by a fresh tattoo, a phoenix rising from flames, its wings curling over the mark of her past. She'd chosen it on her 10th birthday, a quiet celebration in Elliot's penthouse, now transformed from a sterile museum into a home brimming with life. Crayon drawings adorned the fridge toys, littered the marble floors, and the sound of Iris and Noah's giggles filled rooms once silent. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was Elliot's own reckoning, a dismantling of the man he'd been a millionaire blind to the cost of his wealth. The trial had cost him nearly everything. Cresthaven's assets were frozen, his fortune gutted by lawsuits and reparations to victims. He'd surrendered every cent tied to Victor's schemes, keeping only the penthouse and a modest trust for Amara Iris and Noah's future. Yet as he sat here watching Amara face the man who'd branded her, he felt richer than he ever had. The prosecutor called Amara to the stand, and the room hushed. She walked forward, her steps steady, her oversized sweater borrowed from Elliot, making her look smaller, yet her presence filled the space. The jury leaned in their faces a mix of pity and awe. Amara swore the oath, her voice clear, and began. "My name is Amara Harper," she said, her eyes locking onto Victor's. "When I was 7, my mom, Lila Harper, worked for Cresthaven Enterprises. She found out things, money, disappearing accounts that didn't make sense. She told me to stay quiet, said it was dangerous. Then they took her." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, describing the night men dragged her from her home, the branding iron searing her skin, the training facility where children were forced to work, to obey, to forget who they were. "I escaped," she said, her chin lifting. "I took my mom's USB drive, the one she said would keep me safe. I lived on the streets for a year. Then I found Iris and Noah in a dumpster. They were babies left to die. I couldn't leave them because I knew what it's like to be thrown away." The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words pressing against every heart. Elliot's throat tightened, tears burning his eyes. He remembered her in that alley feeding Iris and Noah with scavenged water, her own lips cracked from hunger. Her testimony turned to the USB drive, how she'd kept its dead man's switch active, resetting it every 3 days to prevent the files from leaking until she was ready. "My mom taught me how to protect it," she said. "She knew they'd come for me, like they came for her." When the prosecutor asked about Victor, Amara's gaze didn't waver. "He was there the night they branded me. He said I belonged to Cresthaven, that I'd be useful one day. He said the same about the other kids, dozens of us marked like me." The jury gasped, and Victor's face twitched, his mask of composure cracking. The defense tried to discredit her, painting her as a confused child, but Amara's clarity was unshakable. "I'm not confused," she said, her voice cutting through the lawyer's questions. "I was 9 when I escaped. I kept those babies alive for weeks. I kept my mom's truth alive. You can't make me forget." The jury's eyes glistened, and Elliot saw one juror, an older woman, wipe away a tear. When Amara stepped down, she returned to Elliot's side, her hand slipping into his. "Did I do okay?" she whispered. He squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "You were perfect." He managed his voice rough. Her testimony had done more than convict Victor. It had exposed the human cost of Cresthaven's empire, forcing Elliot to face his own complicity. The judge called a recess, and Elliot led Amara to a quiet room where Iris and Noah waited. The social worker, Sarah, smiled as they entered Noah, toddling toward Amara with a gleeful squeal. Iris, now stronger, clapped her hands from Sarah's lap. "They missed you," Sarah said, her eyes warm. Amara knelt, gathering both babies in her arms, her phoenix tattoo catching the light. Elliot watched, his heart swelling. This was his family now, forged in the ashes of his old life. Sarah pulled him aside, her voice low. "The adoption papers came through this morning. You're officially their guardian, Amara Iris Noah. Congratulations, Elliot." The words hit like a wave, relief and joy washing over him. He'd fought for months navigating hearings and investigations, proving he could be the father they needed. The court had scrutinized his past, his ties to Cresthaven, but Amara's testimony and his willingness to surrender his wealth had convinced them. Back in the courtroom, the closing arguments unfolded. The prosecutor painted Victor as a predator using Cresthaven to traffic children, launder money, and silence anyone who got close to the truth. The defense argued entrapment, claiming Elliot had framed Victor to save himself, but the evidence was overwhelming. Amara's USB drive, decrypted by Clara's tech contacts, contained ledgers, emails, and photos of branded children, their empty eyes haunting the courtroom's projector screen. Victor's own words, recorded during a sting operation Clara had coordinated, sealed his fate. "Those kids are assets, nothing more. Cresthaven needs them to function." The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: human trafficking, murder, racketeering. Victor was sentenced to life without parole, his empire reduced to a cautionary tale. As they left the courthouse, the Manhattan air crisp with autumn, Elliot felt the weight of his old life lift. The paparazzi swarmed, cameras flashing, but Amara walked tall, her hand in his. Iris and Noah, in a stroller, pushed by Sarah. Clara met them outside, her notebook tucked under her arm. "You did it, kid," she said to Amara, her smile fierce. "Your mom would be proud." Amara nodded, her eyes glistening. "She's why I kept going." Clara turned to Elliot. "And you never thought I'd see the day Elliot Grayson turned whistleblower. You're a new man." He shrugged his gaze on Amara. "She made me one." Back at the penthouse, the transformation was complete. The sterile elegance was gone, replaced by a chaotic warmth. Blankets strewn across the couch. A high chair in the kitchen, drawings taped to the windows. Amara ran to her room, a space now painted in bright blues and yellows, and returned with a sketchbook. "Look," she said, showing Elliot a drawing of a phoenix. Its wings spread over a crescent moon. "It's us. Me, Iris, Noah, you." He traced the lines, his fingers lingering on the phoenix. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick. Amara smiled, a real smile, not the weary one from the alley. "I want to be a lawyer," she said suddenly, "to help kids like me, like Mom wanted." Elliot nodded, his heart full. "You will, and I'll be there every step." That night, as Amara read to Iris and Noah in their shared room, Elliot stood at the window, the city's lights no longer a symbol of his conquest, but a reminder of the world he'd helped change. Clara's articles had sparked investigations across 7 states, rescuing 52 children from Victor's facilities, their crescent scars a testament to their survival. Elliot had funded their recovery, selling his last Cresthaven shares to establish a trust for their education and care. His own wealth was a fraction of what it had been, but it was clean-earned through honest investments he'd started rebuilding. The penthouse, once a monument to his ego, was now a home, its walls echoing with laughter, with life. Sarah's monthly visits had become more like family gatherings, her reports glowing with praise for Amara's resilience and Elliot's dedication. As he tucked the babies into their cribs, Amara lingered at the door, her phoenix tattoo a quiet symbol of her strength. "Do you regret it?" she asked her question, a ritual as if testing his heart. Losing everything, Elliot knelt, meeting her eyes. "I didn't lose anything that mattered. I gained you, Iris Noah. That's my wealth now." She nodded, her smile soft but certain. "We're a family," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken after the adoption was finalized from that first night. As the city hummed below, Elliot sat with Amara, watching the babies sleep. The crescent scar was a shadow of the past, overtaken by the phoenix she'd chosen to define her. He'd spent 52 years chasing power only to find purpose in a child's courage, in the love that bound them. Victor's empire was gone, but Amara's legacy, her mother's truth, her own survival would endure. Elliot closed his eyes, the sound of Iris and Noah's breathing a lullaby, and knew he was finally home.